Welcome, everyone. I'm Rebecca Goldberg, the Executive Director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. We welcome you to a special webinar entitled Examining the Pursuit of Justice and Recognition for the Victims of the Sexual Violence Committed by Hamas on October 7th. This semester, the Helen Diller Institute is continuing to explore the impact of war and the questions facing Israel and the region in several different ways. I want to share several of our spring programs. In today's conversation, we will zero in on the sexual and gender-based violence on October 7th and its aftermath with law and gender scholars Ruth Halperin-Kaddari and Masua Sagiv. Last week, we examined Israel before international law bodies in the conflict, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and various other UN human rights mechanisms with international law scholars Yuval Shani and Elena Chachko. We are also holding a two-part webinar series on the impact of the Israel-Hamas war on the Arab-Palestinian community in Israel. In part one of this series, legal scholars Manal Totri-Jubran and Masua Sagiv explored the Arab-Palestinian experience with a legal focus on discrimination, rights, and remedies, and the complexities of citizenship. On April 15th, this coming Monday, in part two of this webinar series, education scholar Ayman Akbaria will continue this conversation with Masua Sagiv from a civil educational perspective, with a focus on citizenship, education, religion, and belonging. Also on April 15th, we will be hosting a conversation in person with author and Shalom Hartman Institute Senior Fellow Yossi Klein Halevi and UC Berkeley Professor of History Ethan Katz, entitled Debates Over Zionism and the Future of the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. Lastly, we continue to invest in our students with a cohort of 30 undergraduate fellows engaging in leadership training, including how to have difficult conversations and how to engage across differences, and planning relevant programs for their peers. Please refer to our website, social media, and our email blast for all of these upcoming programs and for recordings of past programs. All of the programs, activities, and events of our institute are dependent on philanthropic support from the community, and we thank you for your continued support. Now I'm honored to introduce you to Ruth Halperin-Kaddari and Masua Sagiv, speaker and moderator for today's program. Ruth Halperin-Kaddari is an expert on family law and international women's rights and is the founding academic director of the Rackman Center for the Advancement of the Status of Women at Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law, where she serves as a full professor. In December 2018, she completed 3 terms on the UN Committee on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, during which she also served twice as the vice chair of the committee and as the first chair of the working group on inquiries. A graduate of Yale Law School, both the LLM and JSD programs, Ruth Halperin-Kaddari is a renowned speaker in academic and professional forums and has published extensively in her areas of expertise. She is a recipient of numerous research grants and international awards, including an honorary doctorate from Brandeis University, the U.S. State Department Women of Courage Award, and the Human Rights Award of the Ingrid zu Solms Stiftung Foundation in Germany. These days, Professor Halperin-Kaddari has been working tirelessly to achieve justice and recognition for the victims of the sexual violence and gender-based atrocities perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th. Her reputation as a leading human rights defender and her experience on the Committee on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women has allowed her to navigate and gain access to international human rights bodies and Israeli authorities, including leading decision makers at the UN. She was instrumental in securing the fact-finding mission in Israel by the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten. She is doing this work under the DINA project, which she co-founded under the auspices of the Rackman Center. Masua Sagiv will moderate the conversation. The Helen Diller Institute has been blessed to host Professor Sagiv these past 3 years as the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies. She is also the scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute. We're thrilled to share that Masua Sagiv will continue as the Koret Visiting Assistant Professor with the Helen Diller Institute for a 4th academic year in 2020 2024 and 2025. And as you heard, she has been expertly moderating several programs for us this spring. Professor Segev researches and teaches on gender, religion, and law, gender and Judaism, law and social change, and comparative constitutional law. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today. Maybe a word of warning that this is not an easy conversation to hear, but it is nonetheless an important conversation to hear. And we are very privileged to be joined today by Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari, who is working day and night for the past 6 months on bringing justice and recognition to the victims of October 7th. Ruth, can you start by describing to us what we know about the sexual violence that was committed by Hamas on October 7th? What are the facts and what is the legal framing of the situation?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you, Masua, and thank you, Rebecca, for putting this together. As you said, I've been working on this day and night for the past 6 months, and this is actually the expression which is often used to describe other projects. It is a work in progress, and we now know much, much more than what we knew on October 7, 8, or 9, or even what we knew when the New York Times investigation came out on December 23rd. Or during other events in the UN. We know what I would like to put as the kind of threshold of our knowledge is the report that was published by the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Under Secretary General Ms. Pramila Patten, his Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Ms. Patten was she conducted a fact-finding mission in Israel since the end of January into February for 2.5 weeks. I had the privilege of accompanying her during that visit, and so I also had access to much of the information that they gained. And this team employed the UN methodology for verifying information and data. And this is why their findings must be taken as really the benchmark of the facts that are totally undeniable, cannot be refuted. And the bottom line of their findings is that with respect to the hostages, there is clear and convincing evidence that sexual violence was committed on the hostages and is probably still being carried on now. And I'd like everybody now to think for a moment that as we speak, there still are 133 hostages in Gaza, including 19 young women who had been subjected and still are being assaulted, violently, sexually assaulted. And with respect to October 7, the team found that there is reasonable ground to believe that sexual violence, including rape and gang rape and other forms of sexual violence, including mutilation, genital mutilation, was committed in at least 3 locations. And they also found a pattern of bodies, mostly of women, who are stripped from the bottom down or completely naked, indicating that a form of sexual violence was committed on them before they were executed, before they were murdered. I'd like to add to that I stressed that the team employed a very rigid and careful methodology of concluding their findings. And that means that they only put in the report only that information that they could find two independent sources collaborating each other. And so, for example, one of the cases with which we've met was a young officer in the military base of Nahal Oz. That's the military base where the female soldiers, those watchers, tatzpitaniyot in Hebrew, where they had been abducted from and where most of them were actually burnt alive in the headquarters of that base. And when the UN team visited, we came across an officer who returned to that base from healing from the wounds that she suffered on October 7th. So she was a survivor of the October 7th attack on that military base. And she took us through every minute of the ordeal with which she had suffered on that horrific day, including describing hearing a rape that had taken place right below the window of the barrack in which she hid. She described in details how she could understood that it was a rape. She also understands Arabic, so she understood what was going on. She described how she saw the body of the woman, the female soldier, afterwards naked, and she covered her. She also described a body of a male soldier who was mutilated in his genitalia. These incidents were not included in the UN report because they only had the testimony of one witness, one eye, ear witness to the facts. They could not corroborate it with anything else for various reasons, and maybe we'll go later to talk about how the bodies were handled, et cetera, et cetera. But I tell this story because to emphasize that the findings in that report are in fact undermining the scope and the extent of the sexual violence that we know for certainty that was part of the Hamas atrocities on October 7.
Can you speak about the legal framing of the sexual violence as a crime against humanity, as a part of the crime on the international law of the Rome Statute from 1998?
Yeah. So the Rome Statute says that when for the purpose of the statute, and I'm reading, crime against humanity means any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. So we have to note that the element of systematic, widespread or systematic attack, it relates to the attack in general, to the overall attack, meaning the overall Hamas attack of October 7. And with that respect, the UN report talks about a coordinated and systematic attack. So this requirement, this element of the Rome Statute is definitely met. And when rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity, when these are committed as part of that overall widespread or systematic attack with knowledge of the attack, then the requirements of crimes against humanity are met. And so undoubtedly, the Hamas attack was coordinated, was pre-planned, preconceived, it was widespread, at least 22 locations in the southern part of Israel. All the Nukhba and the other Hamas fighters, terrorists, knew of that attack. They trained for that. We know now that they trained for that years before. And they committed these sexual crimes, sexual atrocities, gender atrocities as part of that attack. So there's no doubt that these were crimes against humanity. But I want to add that, again, in terms of what we know that took place, we will never know how many were assaulted or were raped, because the evidence, the forensic evidence, was in fact buried with the bodies. And we can go on later discussing what the reasons for that were, but we cannot know the actual number. But we can know that, as the team found, there was a system of women found naked or partially naked in positions of their bodies that leave no doubt as to what happened before they were murdered. And we know from testimonies of eyewitnesses that came forward starting from November 12th, the first eyewitness testified in front of the police, and the police revealed her testimony in a press conference to the international media. And she described in very, very graphic details the gang rapes, plural, which she witnessed, that also involved a severe form of mutilation of the sexual organ, of the breast, when the female woman was still alive. And this was not the only place where such an element of barbarity and cruelty accompanied the sexual violence. This element of shootings into the genitalia of women and of men, we have evidence for that from pictures of the full bodies that were taken of the soldiers, the bodies of the soldiers that were transferred to the morgue, to the Shura military base. So all these are elements that, in my legal analysis, they form together a picture of extreme, severe cruelty and barbarity that erupted in a very short time, because overall, although for us it seemed like eternity, it was in fact less than 10 hours that these atrocities had taken place before the IDF started fighting back.
Yeah.
So when such extreme cruelty takes place in so many locations at the same time, with exhibiting the same pattern of the acts, this is an indication that it could not have happened without being pre-planned and preconceived and premeditated. So even though we don't even need this conjecture to enter the framework of crimes against humanity, I argue that this is also an indication of the crimes against humanity.
So just to sum up this part, we have the and we have the findings of the report, but the report only shows a segment in a very strict very strict requirements of evidence, and we in fact know of a larger scale. And these crimes can be tried by the International Court of by the International Criminal Court.
So this is a bit more tricky. It can be tried because even though Israel as a state does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, victims, individual victims, have standing in front of the court. And victims, families of victims of October 7, and families of hostages and also hostages that returned from captivity, they already filed complaints with the International Criminal Court, and the court is already investigating this, including the part of the sexual violence. And yes, it can be tried. And as a first measure, and I hold my fingers crossed for that, they can issue an international warrant arrest if they have enough indications to assume that that eventually an indictment and that these crimes will be prosecuted by the court.
And is it, just to clarify, I assume, is it against specific people, or can it be, can the lawsuit be against the leadership of Hamas?
So based on previous experience with the court, the aim of the court, I mean, the court always aims to prove the chain of command and to bring to trial the commanders. And this will probably require longer investigation. And this goes much broader than the elements of the sexual violence. So I assume that this will also be part of the eventual trial.
Now, before we go to talking about the situation on the ground and why there was a quote unquote lack of evidence, even though not really, before that, I think that we can see three types of responses from the international community, international organizations, the West. In general, there are three types of responses, even though they are often overlap. The first type of response that we've seen was justification as resistance, by all means necessary. This is a mean that is part of the necessary need to towards liberation or whatever it is. The second type of response is a response that we can term as denialism. It has a spectrum, right? One of them is the silence, the very loud silence for months by a lot of organizations and people, false equivalency between Israel and Palestine, or denying what happened, or denying that what happened had a systemic pattern, like you said before. We have been seeing several platforms, media platforms, only asking questions, which is a methodology that we already know. And the third type of response is saying, okay, it happened, but whoever tries to highlight it or pursue justice is really weaponizing rape in order to promote the Israeli campaign in Gaza. How do you explain, as someone who has worked for years in the international community as part of the UN, how do you explain these responses, and how do you deal with these responses?
It's a very complex issue to deal with. First of all, to actually realize that these are the responses, and then to figure out the way to handle them, to make sense of them. And I really appreciate that the three groups that you group them together. I agree, because as I said, it's complex, and each of these reactions comes from a different point of view or position. So we cannot really group them together. I'll start with those with which I was the closest to, and they're partially silence, and then partially, as you said, the false equivalence that came very early on, were really quite devastating for me because I didn't expect it. When I started with writing letters to the CEDAW committee, the CRC Committee on the Rights of the Child, or UN Women, or the
And
special...
the CEDAW, just can you say what's the
CEDAW,
acronym?
CEDAW is the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That's the committee in which I was part of for 12 years. And I left the committee just on 2018. So there still are members in the committee who worked with me, who are my friends, my colleagues, and I still might see myself as part of them. And incidentally, they started their session, 3 sessions a year, and the session started exactly on the Monday after October 7. And I knew that. So I knew that when I emailed them on Monday, they're all together and they can start discussing what I tell them and what I ask them. I ask them to recognize, to acknowledge, to admit that there were crimes against humanity in the form of sexual violence. This is what we're working against all these years. I mean, we were there for the Yazidi women. We heard from women in Rwanda, in Bosnia, and now it happened to my own people in my country. And I want them to acknowledge this and to condemn Hamas. I want them to issue a statement, as they did before, for women in Ethiopia and women in Syria and women in DRC. And I waited for 3 weeks until the end of the session. And then on the very last hour of the last day of the session, they issued a statement which is really shameful. It has the title, the most abstract and empty title that one could think of. The cause of peace is the cause of women. It's like saying we want world peace. Nothing in that. And they didn't even mention, they didn't mention Israel, they didn't mention Hamas, they didn't mention sexual violence, didn't mention October 7, nothing. So that was quite shocking for me. But after that, I already was prepared, I think, for all the other reactions. I was no longer surprised when UN Women kept silent for months, as you said, and only were able to utter the words sexual violence and Hamas only on December 3rd, I believe, or around that date. And then other committees saying at the same sentence that concerned for the women in Israel as they are concerned for the women and children in Gaza. This false equivalency, and I always stress that I'm the last one to deny the devastation and the misery and the plight of innocent Palestinians in Gaza, whom I also see as victims of Hamas, but there is nothing there to exonerate Hamas from the horrific crimes that they committed. They went beyond every standard, every permissible rule of war that humanity allows. Rape can never be part of any war or any resistance. It can never be justified by any cause, as noble as it might be, and we can obviously argue about the actual cause, but it can never enter the spectrum of those tools, of those or ways to engage in conflict. And I also I argue against those who try to put a symmetry between what might be improper behavior of IDF soldiers with respect to detainees, to Palestinian detainees, whether it is male or female, and those on the other side build on these unjustified and improper behaviors, and again try to put a false equivalency and put on par the gender atrocities, the rapes, gang rapes, and horrific gender violence, sexual violence that was committed on October 7 with forms of humiliation or threats or perhaps even sexual harassment that, once again, cannot be justified, but anybody with some reasonableness, some sense of reason in their heads, it's beyond me how they can put these two on the same par together.
Can you speak a bit about the lack of evidence in these kinds of crimes, or specifically the lack of evidence on October 7th? What is usually the evidence that we require for these kinds of types, and why wasn't it available? And maybe even more than that, what is the need to have evidence, and the everywhere that we hear that we need to know exactly what happened? What does that do to the efforts to pursue justice and recognition for the victims?
So some of those who deny rely on the fact that there is no forensic evidence. No forensic evidence was gathered from the bodies of the victims. And what's more infuriating, they dare say, how come you have no victims? How come there is nobody who says I was raped on October 7? You don't have victims, so it never happened. Now, this was part of Hamas' satanic plan to leave no evidence, to leave no victims alive. So the tragic truth is that most of those who were assaulted and raped were murdered immediately after, or sometimes even during, the attack, the sexual assault. Of those that survived, most were taken hostage to Gaza. And there are very few, possibly a handful of survivors who are in Israel, but they are in no state of talking. I did talk to a couple of therapists who treat them, and there is no way that they will be able to step forward, perhaps ever, but definitely not now. The UN team also acknowledged that and said that the victims need their own time. The time of international investigation is a different time frame from the time of the victims. And so we cannot expect them to come forward, although we do have an extremely courageous woman who came back from captivity, Amit Susana, who did come forward just 3 weeks ago in the New York Times interview with her. She first spoke with the UN team and shared her experience, gave her testimony. She also gave testimony with the ICC, which we mentioned before, the International Court of Criminal Court. And then she decided to go public, which is an extremely, extremely courageous act of her. And I pray that she will be able to heal. I think she should also now be left alone to process.
There's
But
also some tension, right, between the collective goal or the justice goal and the actual, you know, what the individual goal of
Absolutely.
survivors.
Absolutely, absolutely. That came out when I spoke to the therapist and tried to see if they can perhaps say something, if they, and they were adamant about not jeopardizing any prospect of healing from their patients. So you're right, this is an ongoing tension. So going back to the question of evidence and lack of evidence. So we don't have evidence for first-hand victims because they made sure to leave no victims alive and to silence them forever. And those that actually fall into this trap, they collaborate with this plan of silencing forever. We mustn't let them get away with this. Now, we do have the evidence and the testimonies from eyewitnesses who are themselves survivors of the attack. They are not survivors of direct sexual assaults, but they did see rapes and gang rapes. The first one I mentioned, who came forward at the beginning of November. There are already about 8 or 10 who describe different acts that they had witnessed. And there are, of course, all those eyewitnesses, first responders, whose task was to collect the bodies. And some took pictures, took photographs, and many also gave testimonies of what they had witnessed. And that's where the finding of the pattern of stripped naked women, the positions that show, mutilation and assaults. This is where it comes from. There's also the footage and the photographs that were collected from the body cameras of the Hamas terrorists. And it's really absurd because, you know, when you think of it, the October 7 massacre was probably the most recorded war crime ever committed. Part of the plan was to come with body cameras, with GoPro cameras, record and post online in real time all the atrocities that they committed, and to also send them to families of the victims. I mean, how can you be so cruel as to do that? But then just the following day, they started deleting the files from social media so that they can engage in the campaign of denial. Now, going back to the other issue of forensic evidence, I was in the Shura military base a number of times, and I talked to
tell
the Shura
our audience what it is.
Yes, is the military base in the south that was turned into a morgue. It didn't happen at once. It took several hours to decide that this would be the place to which all the bodies of civilians and soldiers would be transferred. It was divided into a military section and a civilian section. And I talked to some of the team workers who handled the bodies of the soldiers, mostly females, but also of males. And you just get the sense that these were scenes taken from hell, really. I mean, Dante's hell. Bodies, hundreds of bodies piled one on top of the other, many bodies in such a form that could not be identified, dismembered, limbs cut, burnt. Nobody was prepared for a tenth of the magnitude of of what took place there on the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th. Now, much of the collection of the bodies was also done under fire, because this was still a battlefield for several more days after October 7. And the very first and immediate task was to identify the casualties. There were thousands and thousands of family members who had no clue whether their loved ones is dead or alive, or perhaps taken hostage to Gaza. For weeks, we did not even know who was taken hostage to Gaza. There were those who were confirmed dead only weeks after October 7, after employing the most accurate scientific tests of identifying remnants of bones or hair. That we don't need to go into details, but anyway, so the immediate task was to identify and to bring to burial as soon as possible, according also to Jewish tradition. So the question, those who pose the question, how come you didn't employ rape kit? What rape kit? I mean, rape kit is something that a criminal investigation uses in a crime scene. But this was not a crime scene. This was a battlefield. This was war. So it's completely irrelevant to ask these questions. And sadly, we said before, that means that the evidence was buried with the bodies. But we have so much other evidence, so many other indications and testimonies and pictures and photographs and footage. So no possibility to deny.
Is it also, can it also be said that there was no, the mindset of the first responders was not directed towards sexual crimes, because it's not something that we are used to in the context of the conflict so far?
Yeah, absolutely. This had never been part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict before, at least not since the establishment of the State of Israel, not going back to 1929. But, to give you an example of just what you said now, I talked to the doctor, to the physician who is in charge of the trauma room in the Soroka hospital. Soroka is the hospital in Be'er Sheva to which most of the injured on that Saturday were brought. About 700 people were brought to Soroka hospital. And the trauma room is the room to which victims of sexual assaults are usually brought to undergo an examination, to collect evidence, to see, to diagnose whether they had indeed suffered sexual assault or not in regular times, right? So I talked to her just to ask whether anybody was admitted to the trauma room after October 7. And she said, no, nobody asked, nobody of the injured asked. But what's more telling is that the initial intake by the physicians did not include any questioning on, have you been subjected to any kind of a sexual assault? This was not part of the protocol for people who survive a terror attack. I mean, the connection between a terror attack and rape, sexual assault, was not there. And just like you said, it's very obvious that it wasn't there, because we never experienced this kind of terror weaponization of the bodies, using sexual violence as a tool of war was never part of a terror attack or of the war.
So if you combine together the fact that everything was under fire, people, the first priority was to identify and to bring dignity to those to the people that we lost, and the fact that this was not in the mindset, and everything under war, it really is clear why there aren't forensic evidence, and still at the same time we have so many other evidence. I just want to acknowledge here that we are receiving a lot of questions, and I hope I'll try as many to get to as many as possible. And we are, again, very grateful for the opportunity to be speaking to you. Maybe I'll combine it the following. You have been doing this work, as we said, for 6 months. Can you walk us through when you started to understand that this is different, that this is urgent, that you have to work to start working in order to pursue justice? And if you can speak about the advocacy that you have been doing, and other individuals and other organizations, and if you can speak about the differentiation between civil society and state authorities, and also how confident you are about the trustworthiness of international organizations or international institutions in reaching justice. If we have been talking about the ICC itself, I've asked a lot of questions, so I'm going to let you answer now.
Okay, well, I try to tackle them one by one. It's 6 months after the fact, and so while I'm in it 24/7, I did already have some time to, to go back, to reflect on these months and how it started. And it started on October 8th. On October 7, like everybody else, I just watched unbelievably the screens, not being able to grasp what we were seeing. I wasn't in Israel. I was in the middle of a lecture tour on the judicial overhaul. if you remember that of last year, and I was on my way. I was in Europe. I was on my way to continue to to the US. Of course, this didn't happen. And on that Sunday, when it sunk in me that Hamas had so many hours to operate uninterruptedly before IDF started fighting back in so many locations, civilian and military, and then remembering those horror stories that I heard on the years in my years on the CEDAW committee in the UN, from women survivors of other conflicts, survivors of sexual assault, from Bosnia and from Rwanda, and thinking about what we know is taking place in the Ukraine by Russian people. I figured that there's no question this was part of what was happening and what happened in the day before. There were already rumors starting to spread on social media, and people started talking about what they heard. Mm-hmm. And that's when I understood that I'm placed in a very special position, knowing the working methods and all the different mechanisms in the UN, those whom we can work with, and I can reach out to them, and I am respected by them, and still I'm not part of the government. So it's not that a formal governmental official is asking to meet with the High Commissioner of Human Rights. I am an independent expert. When I sat on the UN CEDAW committee. I was there not as Israeli, but as an independent expert, advocating for the women of the whole world, not for women of Israel. And so I realized that I have an obligation here to use my special position in order to advocate for justice for our people, but also for justice for humanity at large. Because if these UN bodies are failing, they're failing to bring to justice, to demand accountability on the part of these Hamas terrorists, then they're failing the whole of humanity. They're undermining the whole justification for their work, for their role. They're really working against all of us, not against Israel per se. And on that Sunday, I also remembered immediately that the person who is placed within the UN in the most relevant position to help us, to assist us, to engage with us, is a former member of the CEDAW committee and a friend of mine, who is now in the position of the Undersecretary General for Sexual Violence in Conflict times. And that's when I reached out to her already on October 8th, on Sunday.
Already on October 8th.
Yes, and I told her, Pramila, we need you here. And the first thing that she asked me was, do you know if it really happened? And then I was taken aback. Is she doubting what I'm telling her? But on a second reflection, it was clear to me that she knows what lies ahead. She knows all the obstacles that we will face in our pursuit for justice, in trying to gather the information, the most reliable and verified information that exists. And she prepares me to be able to do this task that I was about to take on myself. And she already knew then that not only her, but all of us, that we would all be attacked, that we would face. I don't think that she could envision the extent of the denial campaign and the coalition that all Hamas allies that help them in denying and in spreading the fake and all that. They're not, of course, they're not acting alone. They have their allies in the form of Iran and China and Russia. So I don't think that she could really foresee the extremity to which all this will go. But as experienced and as she is in this role of special representative for sexual violence in conflict, she knew that this would be a very, very challenging and full of obstacles, this endeavor.
Is this something that I'm just stopping you for 1 second? Is this something that is unique as compared to other situations and to other war-related sexual violence cases?
So this sense of searching for the truth and the difficulties in obtaining the truth and the quarrel about the narrative is not unique to our context, and it's not unique to the context of sexual violence in regular times. I mean, you always, you know, victims are never never see themselves as free to come out and speak out. The whole Me Too movement started because of the lack of trust and disbelief of victims of sexual violence and sexual assaults, especially in times of conflict when chaos reigns. It makes things much more difficult when survivors of sexual violence in conflict times, they're not only survivors of the sexual assault, they're sometimes, very often, they're survivors of assaults on their lives, as a whole. So the trauma is multifaceted trauma, and that is why the search for their voice, for revealing what they for speaking out, it's so much more difficult. But in other conflicts that took place recently also, there were more survivors. There were women who were willing to come out and speak up. It's also the question, I think, of anonymity. The Israeli society is very small. It's much smaller than any of the other victim societies of other conflict areas that we know of. And sadly, the shame and the humiliation that comes together with afflicting sexual assaults and sexual violence impacts also the willingness to step up, especially when one knows that she would immediately be recognized. And when the family knows that their loved one would be recognized, would be known, would lose anonymity, and everybody would know. So I think that these, and there are other reasons also, but there are reasons that make our context even more challenging in that respect from other wartime context of sexual violence.
So let's get back to the activism and advocacy that you have described. Can you talk a bit about the through your story and your journey in pursuing justice and recognition? Can you talk about the relationship between civic society and the state? Do you think that sometimes the state is even a barrier in our case in pursuing justice and recognition? Is the relevance of us being not just a state in war but Israel in war, and also whether do you trust now the international institutions? Do you think that the ICC is an institution that we can trust?
Okay. Again, there are several layers to these questions. The first encounter with the state and the role of the state following October 7 was not promising, as we saw on all fronts. The IDF was not there. There were independent civilians who heroically came first to rescue, and some of them indeed managed to rescue survivors. Then jumping ahead to the question of advocacy, so there too, it's not just that I realize that I have a specific responsibility based on my own experience and unique position. It's also a realization that there's nobody else to do that. So, and also it wasn't just the advocacy vis-a-vis the international community, it was also engaging with the governmental institutions domestically to make them realize that something unique had happened here. Even going back to the question of evidence, I mean, performing forensic examinations was really out of the question. But taking pictures of the whole bodies, that was something that could be done. And it was done with respect to the bodies of the soldiers, but not with respect to the bodies of the civilians. And there were many of, well, not many of us, there were a number of us, because I'm in this endeavor not alone. There are colleagues and there are friends and other professionals, professional women who come from the field of sexual violence, of law, of welfare, of health workers. And we started working together immediately on the Monday after October 7. And we tried to use our relationships, our connections with the people in the high-level positions to flag to them that, yes, it is a war, but there were also crimes committed here, and we must try as hard as we can to be aware of this, to be knowledgeable of this, and to collect evidence, to treat it also as a crime. And the police unit that was put in charge of investigating all of the October 7 attack, they formed a subunit for investigating only the gendered aspects of October 7. They formed it only 2.5 weeks after October 7. So this just gives an indication of, again, of the failure on so many parts of the government. But now I want to go and give the other side of this, or the half full part of the glass, which is that they did recognize quite early on that they do need civil society and that they do need the help of the academia. And again, talking from my narrow perspective, right? I don't know about other areas, but from my perspective and from my experience, when they realized, for instance, that I can meet with the High Commissioner of Human Rights, or that I was actually invited to brief the Security Council of the UN on the sexual violence of October 7, they understood that they must open the doors and give access, give me, not government, not civil servant, civil society and academia, they give me access to investigation materials, to the police, to the IDF, to the Shin Bet, to the intelligence, and allow me to have the most accurate information, the most credible information, because whenever I speak on the international front, I must be held credible. I must be held, people must have confidence in what I say. And this goes on until now. We've now formed, as Rebecca also explained at the beginning, now I'm part of a team which is called the DINA project, DINA 710. And DINA, we chose the name because DINA was the first known survivor of sexual assault, the book of Genesis, the daughter of Jacob. And Dina in Hebrew also means her justice or her law, Hadin Shela. So we thought that this is an appropriate name. And we are five experts, 5 professionals coming from a range of areas, engaging with the government on several fronts, not just the advocacy, the international advocacy, but also the legal front, the question of the future criminal proceedings, also in Israel, perhaps changes of legislation. So this unprecedented situation also allowed for an unprecedented method of governmental engagement with civil society.
Can you speak about the different, you mentioned some of it now. What are the different avenues of advocacy in this situation?
I like to think about this on justice on several fronts. There's justice through litigation. And litigation here also can take several forms. It can take the form of criminal proceedings domestically, criminal proceedings internationally, like with the ICC, as we mentioned, or with other countries that employ universal jurisdiction, but also civil proceedings of bringing suits, compensation, when for victims of other nationalities. We know that of all those casualties of October 7, and now with respect to the hostages, there were and are nationalities from dozens of other countries in the world. So justice, to pursue justice through legal proceedings, can also be in the form of civil proceedings in Israel or elsewhere. And then there's the level of what I like to call historical justice, of the historical recognition. And I realized very early on that I can phrase it in the following way, that when in the future in my class on legal feminism, whenever I will talk about sexual violence in conflict and the weaponization of women and the use of rape as a tool of war, I will not just talk about Rwanda and DRC and the Yazidis, but I and my colleagues elsewhere in the world will also mention Nahal Oz and Nova and Be'eri in the same breath. So this is where historical justice will be done. And in that respect, the UN report is the first step. So the next steps are continuing with this investigation. As they said themselves, there needs to be more time. There needs to be a full-fledged investigation. In Ukraine, for example, the team was there again half a year after the first visit. And after half a year, they could meet with survivors. So we need more time for that. And part of the advocacy is to have this exercise continued, perhaps also by other teams or by other mechanisms. And part of the advocacy is also to convince other countries in the world to recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization, as an organization, as an entity that should be put in the blacklist of the UN, of those entities that commit and condone and permit the use of sexual violence as a tool of war. And it is also to go after Hamas allies, to issue sanctions not just against Hamas, but also against all its allies who help them commit their atrocities. Again, I mentioned Iran, China, Russia, even Turkey. We know of the relationship between Turkey and Hamas leadership. Just like the world united against ISIS in a coalition and employed so many of its tools against this one organization, the same way they should now come together and act as a coalition against Hamas.
Which is a complex piece of advocacy, considering other political ramifications, of course. For maybe as the last question for today, we've been getting a few versions of this. What would be your advice for people who want to get involved, whether we are talking about law school students listening and watching that want to be involved, or people who want to help make an impact on this issue? You've mentioned the DINA project, which maybe you'll say something about ways, either actions to take, or maybe I'm sure that resources could help. If you want to highlight a few ways that people can contribute and help and come together for this cause.
I think that a lot of the a major part of the what I call the battle over the narrative of the war over the narrative, which we're now facing, comes from ignorance and from the fact that we live in an era where in which it is very, very difficult to formulate an informed position because of the spread of misinformation and disinformation and fake. And so one of our goals in the DINA project is indeed to be able to create a kind of resource or clearinghouse where we can put information that focusing on the issue of sexual violence, not on all aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the war in Gaza, but all the information that we know to be credible and that we know that can be used and should be used, should be spread out. For instance, again, the report of the special representative did not receive as much media attention and just the publicity as it should have. Partly also because much of the media is biased. You know, we didn't talk about it, but part of the reaction of the international community, international human rights community, and international media was because they found it so hard to flip their mind and realize that the equation had shifted. And for once, on October 7, it was Hamas, supposedly representing Palestinians, which was the aggressor and the attacker, committing all these horrific crimes, and Israel was the victim. I mean, it's impossible for them to not see the Palestinians as the ultimate victim. So I think that this also explains why such findings by UN were not highlighted, because it contradicts their very, very set mind frame. So it is really up to us to formulate such a resource center for use. There are websites where one can find information to amplify, to spread, to continue spreading around. There's the organization of Stand With Us. There's even the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'm not saying the website of Hasbara Israel. Ministry of Foreign Affairs is on its own in that respect. And I think that the question of how can one be engaged is realize that each one of us can be an activist in this battle on this front on social media, because this front takes place, this war takes place on social media and mostly there. And also engage with, as Americans, you have direct access to your representatives, whether it is in the state, in the House of Representatives, in the Senate. So whenever you see maybe propositions that defect from what we know to be the truth, then you should flag it out, and you should demand that to continue in the path of justice in that respect. But again, I know that when I said that there's a lot of work still to be done, this is definitely a major part of what we must do, must continue doing right now.
Thank you so much, Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari, for taking the time and having this conversation with us. Thank you everyone in the audience who joined. Rebecca, thank you for facilitating this, for making this event happen. I'm gonna bring it back to you now, Rebecca.
Thank you. I want to thank you both. Thank you, Ms. Wasegi, for framing this conversation with some thought-provoking and difficult questions. And thank you to Ruth Halperin-Kaddari. We're really grateful to be able to host you. We hope it's not the last time that we'll be able to bring you also in person. I want to acknowledge that the 6 months must have been extremely difficult, and we're very grateful for your work and for bringing it to light here in a really difficult conversation, but with really thought-provoking insights. And we're very grateful for this conversation having taken place. So thank you both.
Thank you.